as we come now to the second week of Lent, the second Sunday of Lent. And our readings for this week are, the first comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 15, verses 5 through 12, and then verses 17 and 18. The second reading comes from Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 3, verses 17, and then chapter 1 through verse 1. So that just flows like that. And finally, the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 9, verse 28b through 36. Now, in the liturgy for the Lenten time in our Catholic tradition, the second weekend, or the second Sunday, if you want, of Lent, is given over to the event of Jesus on the mountain, often called the Transfiguration. As we may have noticed on other occasions, in other traditions, this particular reading is used in the last week of the Epiphany season, bringing to an end the manifestation of Jesus as certainly the divine Son of God. But for our tradition, it occurs on this second time in the Lenten season. Now, much discussion, and remember that basically here, as these talks kind of evolve, I like to spend a little bit of time as to how it fits into the pattern of the particular gospel that we are looking at. Now, this episode of Jesus that we look at this time is also found in Mark and Matthew, but there are some differences in how this is approached. We, in Matthew and Mark, do not know why Jesus goes up this mountain. In Luke, however, he goes up it to pray. And we have noticed on a number of occasions that in the Lucan tradition, before important events happen in Jesus' life, he prays. So there's a kind of hint that something important is here in this episode by the fact that Jesus goes up to pray. Now, what exactly happens in this event? The ancient Mediterranean world, remember that this is the world in which the traditions of Jesus and the writings of Luke take place, we're familiar with what we would call alternate reality experiences. Things that are different than the normal way in which things take place. And often, these experiences happen in a trance, that the person is caught up in some kind of experience. We find evidence of this in the Old Testament. For example, prophets like Isaiah in chapter 6, Jeremiah in chapter 1, and Ezekiel in chapter 1 are all described as having an experience of God in an alternate reality. So, and the entire book of Revelation in the New Testament is also based in this kind of experience. So, an alternate experience of reality. Now, exactly how do you express that in words, and how is that seen in image, of course, is interesting. It perhaps is seen words like ecstasy or trance, not that they're not real, but nevertheless, ways in which they are experienced. This idea is not unique to the synoptic writers. One of the great healing gods of the ancient world, Aesculapius, who was ill, was taken to a temple place where he wanted to be cured, and he was, and interestingly, his mother also had a dream in which the same thing happened, and so there was a coming together of this. Now, I just mention all of this as a little bit to say that in some ways this episode, important in the New Testament, has some characteristics that are typical of the world in which this story was narrated. All right, so on this hill, Jesus is, now what happens? Jesus is the word transfigured is not really used by Luke. What happens is that Jesus' face becomes enlightened, and his clothes, yes, kind of flow also in that way. Now, who sees this transformation or this event? 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, accompany him. This, of course, is the famous trio that often goes with Jesus on important experiences. But as the opening episode begins, they are sleeping. So in a certain way, who sees this vision? But, well, we the reader, or the hearer, or the listener. And as Jesus is there, appearing with him are Moses and Elijah. Now, exactly what's the purpose of these 2 figures, Elijah and Moses? Well, Moses, one way of interpreting it, reflects the law, and Elijah represents the prophets. Or are these figures here because both of them have been pictured in the scriptures as ascending up into heaven? Elijah in a fiery chariot, Moses at the end was taken up by God. Or are they eschatological figures? Namely, they will appear on earth before the coming of the new kingdom or the end time. So even interpreters as to why these 2 figures take place and what their importance is varies depending on interpreters. And I just kind of want to run that by us that there are different scholars who look at this and give alternate kind of interpretations of why these 2 figures are there. Now, what they are pictured, as Luke tells it, of talking about Jesus' exodus. Now, exactly what the nature of the conversation is, we don't know, okay? Now, of course, we can have 2 understandings of the term exodus. One could simply be, and that's why the story may be placed here, Jesus' exodus from life. Namely, that as he is going up to Jerusalem, things will go badly, he will suffer and die, and will leave this life. Or the Exodus can be a reference to Israel's journey, of course, through the wilderness years, coming out of the land of bondage and entering into the promised land. So Exodus here, depending, I suppose, on whether it's capital X, E rather, Exodus, familiar event, or simply an action, a leaving. He exits the room, exodus. So notice different ways, certainly, in which this particular term could be understood. Now, what exactly, as I mentioned, the 2 prophet and Moses, in a certain way, also is a prophet. When we think about it, he is the spokesperson for God, but usually is connected with the law, and that maybe is one way to see this. Now, also notice that the emphasis, as I mentioned, I think a couple of minutes ago, that in this event, the emphasis is on the face of Jesus. He is seen. Now, there's a kind of glory, but the emphasis in Mark and Matthew is on the whole figure. Here it's on the face of Jesus, reminiscent of the fact that Moses, you remember, had encountered God face to face, so much so that when he left, as the stories are told, when he left the the tent in the wilderness, his face was so bright that he had to put a kind of mask or a shield or a veil over because of the radiance or the brilliance from this experience with God. So is that something that Luke has in mind here, a connection between the event of Moses' encounter with the Lord and Jesus? Also, there was another Old Testament experience in which Hannah, who, as you might remember, had come to the Shiloh to pray for a son. She had been there, and as a result of this experience, she had not encountered God, but in some way had come face to face with the Lord. So, and that's in the First Samuel book, and you can check that out. And what I'm suggesting here is there are some Old Testament or Hebrew scripture connections that Luke, who often does not seem to openly make allusions to that, uses as part of his understanding of what happens. All right, so that's the first part. Then the disciples wake up, that is Peter, James, and John. Now, it's interesting here that Peter takes the initiative. In fact, the text you will read is Peter and his companions. And as we have noted and will note, that in this gospel, Peter is often placed in a very important and kind of leadership role. And again, you get here that Peter addresses Jesus. They are, and watch how this happens, they are now taken into a cloud, and they are afraid. And in the cloud, how much can you see in a cloud? How far can you see in a cloud? But keep in mind that cloud often represents the very presence of God. So they are caught up in the cloud, and they hear the voice again, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." Keep in mind that this same voice had appeared when Jesus had been baptized. So in the cloud is the presence of God and the voice of God encouraging these three to remember and to honor Jesus as certainly the one upon whom God's favor rests, but also the divine Son. So it's also important to notice that in the episode just following this, now you're not here, it is, that Jesus is pictured as setting his face to go to Jerusalem. So that may well be why this particular episode is brought to our attention here, that the journey of Jesus to Jerusalem is one that will not end happily for Jesus. And but his journey will continue, and the disciples, as they now are getting ready to leave this mountain, we don't know how high it was or exactly where it was, although, and here's an interesting point, that Luke refers to this mountain as the Mount of Olives. Now, the Mount of Olives is located just outside the city of Jerusalem. Later on in this gospel, in chapter 19, it will be the place where the agony of Jesus in the garden takes place. And in the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 1, it is the place where Jesus speaks to his disciples and is taken up into heaven. So is there a connection here between what happens in this episode and ultimately Jesus going up to the Father, ascending into heaven? So there again are connections here that might be made. Peter says to Jesus, can we stay here? So he is not so interested in immediately leading, and says, we will put 3 tents here, one for you, one for Elijah, and one for Moses. The text says he did not know what he was saying. Well, he may himself somehow be caught up in the aftermath of this ecstasy, of this whole kind of interesting event. Now, this does not happen, and there is a concern here, because if there are 3 tents, one for Jesus, one for Elijah, and one for Moses, is he equating, by asking this thing, Moses and Elijah with Jesus? And that, again, is not what the gospel wants us to see, that there's something more to Jesus that is happening in this experience. So that's not going to work. Tents, well, that would remind one of the Jewish feast of Tabernacle, in which, as you know, they live in tents outside their home for the week of celebrating that event. That's one of the 3 important events in Jewish life, certainly observed in Jesus' time. So there's a lot of imagery going on there. As they come down the mountain, the disciples say, that is, Peter, James, and John, say nothing about what had happened up on the hill. So it would seem to be a further illustration of God's choosing and recognizing the nobility of Jesus, namely and the divineness of Jesus as Son of God, but also as encouraging Jesus to continue his journey to Jerusalem. I mention because sometimes we take for granted what will happen when Jesus comes to Jerusalem. Now, and it's interesting here, may I mention, a theological point of view, which is different in some other parts of the New Testament, is why is Jesus destined to die? Now, a common understanding that perhaps we have heard and has often been taught is that God sent his Son to die for our sins. Now, such a formulation, however, that Jesus is going to die for our sins, cannot be formulated by the Lucan gospel here, okay? Rather, Jesus' death is that which belongs to and is relegated to prophets. Jesus, you remember, in this gospel, is one of the primary images of Jesus is that he is indeed the prophet of God, and that prophets often speak words that the home community need to hear but don't want to hear, or the prophet may be speaking to those outside the community that also could be encouraging or challenged. So from Luke's point of view, and that perhaps is interesting to note, as Jesus continues his journey to Jerusalem, he will, and what awaits him is the fate of a prophet. Many of the great prophets, as we noted, had been rejected and were rejected. Not only their teaching, but even their lives were attempted to be taken. Such is the case, for example, of Jeremiah, although he is not one of the major figures in Luke's tradition, nevertheless is important to notice. So Jesus' death is going to be that, as I mentioned, of a rejected prophet, not an atonement for sin. As God's chosen one, Jesus also chooses, and that perhaps is what is the message that comes from this episode, to continue his mission forward to Jerusalem. As we've noted on other occasions, Jerusalem always becomes, in Lucan's tradition, the center, the heart of where the important things in the story of Jesus and the story of Christianity takes place. So he's on his way now to Jerusalem. The election, and just to conclude this section, the election of Jesus by God does not exempt him from suffering. And perhaps why this fits certainly into the Lenten understanding here is that Jesus' mission includes suffering. It is certainly not something that he would want, but was something that would happen because of the role he played in the story of Israel and the story of our story. So that is the gospel message of this time. The first reading comes from the book of Genesis, and because usually the first reading on the second Sunday of Lent deals somewhat with Abraham, in this case is what happens here. In this episode, he's still called Abram. His name has not been changed to Abraham yet. And in some ways, he is going to experience what I mentioned at the beginning here, is what we might call an altered state of consciousness, in which he, that is Abraham, receives from God a twofold promise, that he will be the father of a great people and that he will receive a land. Now, as we've noticed on other occasions, the whole story in the Pentateuch, that is the Torah, the first 5 books, spells out how this promise now made to Abraham will be fulfilled. Namely, many go outside. Can you count the number of stars in the heavens? Well, that will be the number of offspring that you will have, and the giving of the land. And keep in mind that the entrance of the Israelites into the land of promise does not occur until the last part of the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book of the Pentateuch. So it will take a number of episodes and stories and events before the Israelites really receive the promised land. All right. Abraham's is, as I mentioned, now enters into, Abraham asks for a sign. It's interesting that this is a traditional kind of question that is asked by people who are given important messages by God. This is not, when Abraham asks for a sign, that he has a lack of faith, but rather that he has an uncertainty about whether, just about what this is all about and how this is going to be worked out. And so when he asks for a sign, God now makes with Abraham a covenant. Covenants, of course, we have often seen are agreements made by 2 groups, usually one having power, one not having power. And in this case, you could see that the one having power would be the Lord, not having power would be Abraham. The terms of a covenant are generally dictated by the one having power. The one without power has to accept those terms in order for the covenant to happen. Now, this is a unique covenant in which, yes, the terms of the covenant are given by God, but Abraham is not required and does not make any assent to it. So in a certain way, although he does certainly, but in a certain way, this is a different kind of covenant. How does this one work? Well, a number of animals are brought and split down the middle and lie on the other side, so that there's kind of a path of walking through all these animals. And what happens is that Abraham doesn't walk through, but there appears a smoking fire pot or a flaming torch, and it moves through the lineup of kind of split animals. And of course, this would be illustration of God working to, and the term that is perhaps used here, cutting the covenant, okay? That God's presence in fire, and we see how often in the scriptures that is one of the images that represents the presence of God, does it not? But as he does, the animals are not burned. Now, in other traditions, when they offered sacrifice to the gods, animals were placed on the altar and they were burned, and the smoke arose to the divine. It doesn't happen here. Simply moves through, and the animals are not eaten. In other traditions, once the sacrifice of the animals had been made, what was left was given to the priests to be consumed. None of that happens here. So again, this is something unique. Now, as we hear this episode, just this time, Abraham does not seem to be conscious of a ritual performance. He is cast, and here we go, into a trance. So notice that this might be one of the connections that this reading has with the gospel that we have examined this time. A trance in Genesis reminds us of what God did to Adam when he was looking for a suitable partner for Adam. Remember, cast Adam into a trance and took from him material that created Eve. So whenever we're engaged in these kind of activities, there's a mysteriousness that takes place. And God works in kind of these interesting ways, doesn't God work? So the point being that what God does is too mysterious for human eyes to witness. So anyway, God inaugurates with Abraham this covenant. As I say, he will be the father of a great nation of many peoples, and you have to continue to read in the book of Genesis how the Abraham account does indicate this. So hopefully as we hear this story, we are not caught up in any kind of a trance, but accept that is in the prayer that we together celebrate and make as we gather together. In conclusion, the little episode from the Philippians is where Paul again is saying to the community at Philippi, why don't you pay attention to the teaching that I have given? Stop trying to return to an older way. I have given you the correct message. Live that out. Maybe on another occasion we can go into this episode a little bit more, but I wanted to quickly say that Paul here is arguing with or hoping that the Philippians will keep the course that he has taught. May we keep the course that Jesus teaches. Thank you for being with us. Hope to see you again.